Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Richard Smoley. Richard Smoley has over 35 years' experience studying and practicing mystical spirituality and philosophy. His latest book is The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness. Other works of his are Inner Christianity, A Guide to the Esoteric Tradition, The Dice Game of Shiva, How Consciousness Creates the Universe, Conscious Love, Insights from Mystical Christianity, Forbidden Faith, The Secret History of Gnosticism, The Essential Nostradamus, and Hidden Wisdom, A Guide to the Western Inner Traditions, which he wrote with J. Kinney. Richard is the former editor of Gnosis, a journal of the Western Inner Traditions. Currently, he is editor of Quest, Journal of the Theosophical Society in America. His website is innerchristianity.com. Richard's latest book, How God Became God, What Scholars Are Really Saying About God and the Bible, was published in June 2016. So hello, Richard. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice to chat with you. As I first encountered your work actually because my partner gave me The Dice Game of Shiva as a gift, and reading that book was really affirmative for me in a lot of ways because I found that I discovered that you and I had sort of a similar development kind of having a disillusionment with the Western traditions, Western philosophical traditions, and what they were able to offer in terms of the kind of more realized wisdom that you talk a lot about in your books. So I would love to maybe first start off with having you take us on that story a little bit of that you explored in The Dice Game of Shiva, of how you discovered the more mystical traditions and what sort of led you to this lifelong path that you're on.
Well, my father was always interested in these subjects when I was a kid. He had books about Edgar Cayce and UFOs. This was in the 60s. He had a lot of those things around, and I read them. Mm-hmm. So there was an interest in the background. I didn't do much with it when I was an undergraduate, but after I went to Oxford, and part of my degree was in philosophy and literature, particularly classical literature. And Oxford is a curious place to study philosophy because you're not studying it the way you would study it in an American academic institution.
Yeah.
You're basically, there is its own school of philosophy. It would be like going to the Academy of Plato or, Aristotle's Lyceum. You're learning a particular type of philosophy, which is Oxford philosophy. And I found it really very arid. Mm-hmm. It was very, very, it took materialism broadly defined as, almost self-evidently true. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I don't think they really understood Plato particularly well, even though, a part of the course involved reading the Republican Greek.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they really actually kind of understood the different levels of consciousness that Plato was talking about. Mm-hmm. And while I was there, more or less accidentally, I came across a group that was studying the Kabbalah, which is one aspect of the Western mystical traditions. And the people I met through that, some of whom I'm still in touch with, I thought were very, very high quality.
Yeah.
And there really seemed access to what I would call knowledge in a real sense, rather than, shall we say, using Plato's words, say opinion.
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of like the difference between small K knowledge and big K knowledge, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So once I finished there, I went to San Francisco, and my interest in spirituality continued to grow. And I studied a lot of different things out there because it was, this was San Francisco in the 80s, and that was really kind of the height of the New Age in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so I studied things like A Course in Miracles, Tibetan Buddhism, and the Gurdjieff work. Around the age of 30, I realized, well, if I'm going to be a writer and get a job as a writer or an editor, I may as well get a job in a field that interests me innately. So I started writing around in various magazines that published on these topics at the time. Now, there were a lot more of them. They were smaller. It was a great time for small magazines in a way that now really isn't. and one of them was Gnosis, which had just gotten started. It was a journal of the Western inner tradition, so it was very close to my core interests. And I started writing for them. I ended up working as editor for a long time, which gave me a lot of exposure to a lot of different angles and aspects of, Western esotericism, although that wasn't, rigidly defined. So I was able kind of both personally and professionally to, take a course that was, a little bit more philosophical in what I would say the old sense is, rather than, the academic philosophy of that time and the present, which are more or less the same, at least in terms of outlook and ideas, which I found very, very unsatisfying.
Yeah. So I want to I'll go a little bit, because into that sort of distinction between what has become kind of the culturally sanctioned notion of Western philosophy and this other stream that now we're calling the mystical traditions or the mystical stream. But really, from what I understand, at one point there was no distinction between them. So can you talk a little bit about, what were the historical preoccupations that led to this kind of divergence of, what we will call, the Western academically sanctioned philosophical tradition from the esoteric traditions?
Well, initially, going back to the ancient Greeks, as you say, there was no difference between the two.
Yeah.
Pythagoras had what we would call an esoteric school. Plato had something similar. And you could argue that what Plato was, in a way, trying to do was express the insights of the ancient wisdom, esoteric knowledge, in the new philosophical language that the sophists had developed in 5th century Greece. So those currents kind of kept surfacing, and there was no real difference all throughout antiquity.
Yeah.
Now, the big break came with Christianity, where Christianity rapidly assumed an extremely dogmatic form. I'm talking about the 4th century AD and on.
Right.
And you really had to believe that, or get your tongue torn out, which happened sometimes. And although there was still a strong mystical element in Christianity at the time, and which continued mostly in the Eastern Orthodox Church. In the West, it all kind of came to a head in the High Middle Ages with scholasticism, the rediscovery of Aristotle. And although there are a lot of intellectual currents that fed into this, one thing that was going on also was an increasing mistrust of mystical experience, because it could so easily lead to heresy in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And so more and more that became shunted aside. The Aristotelian logic and rationalism became the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. As far as I know, it still is. Scholasticism.
Yeah.
And when the Protestants broke with all of this, they didn't want the traditions of the church, which they no longer trusted. So all they had was the Bible, sola scriptura, as the source of authority. And more they focused increasingly on the literal meaning of the Bible as the sole meaning of the Bible. And to carry the conversation on further, by the 19th century, or the 18th century, the literal truth of the Bible was seen as being all there was. And you had two choices with this literal Bible. You could either accept it wholeheartedly and just, it's all true, because God said so, which gives you fundamentalism and evangelical Christianity.
Yeah.
Or you could actually delve into the actual literal truth of the Bible from a historical, critical perspective.
Yeah.
And it turns out that a lot of the things that the Bible said happened didn't happen. And liberal Protestantism is, in a way, kind of in a crisis because of this, because they don't really know what to do with the Bible anymore, except use it as kind of like a storybook with, things to lecture on Sunday. And that enormous crisis of faith of liberal Protestantism in itself, has it's shaken America in political ways as well as religious ones. Anyway, that's a short capsule of a 2,500-year process.
Yeah, well, that's a very nice abridged version. So to go back a little bit I want to go back to what you said about the mystics sort of not being permitted. Do you think that was as a result of the institutionalization of the church, that somehow, those that were engaged in or having mystical experiences, they couldn't be kind of controlled by the institution, or the institution itself couldn't make sense of what they were doing in such a way that maybe the mystical was actually radically opposed to the kind of institutional framework that the church was offering?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
And if you want to take examples, probably one of the most famous is Meister Eckhart,
right,
in the early 14th century, who was very learned in all of the scholastic ideas that I just mentioned. He knew the academic side of it back to front, and he was a lecturer and a professor in those areas, and that's why he's called Meister, master. But his own mystical experiences led him to a more transcendent God, beyond the God of the Trinity. And the church didn't like this.
Yeah.
And he was condemned by the Inquisition, but he had the good fortune to die before they could really put it into effect, so they didn't have to burn him at the stake or anything. So he basically died at just a very opportune moment.
I guess that's good for him. So yeah. So now I want to talk a little bit about, maybe we could explore we've talked about, the difference between the mystical and the institutional, but what would you say if you were to try to describe, the fundamental teachings of kind of the mystical traditions, if we can kind of lump them all together? I know that's a generalization, but what is the essence of the kind of the Western mystical traditions and their teachings?
Well, one important aspect of them, and I think this is more or less universal, is that there are different levels of reality. The physical level that we take for granted is there. You can't really deny that. Yeah. But it is only one of several, and it is generally considered to be the lowest. And these other states not only exist, but can be accessed through higher states of consciousness, through mystical practice. And one can connect these higher worlds with the lower world. So in terms of gaining deeper experience, and also in terms of providing kind of a service to the world, in that this kind of circulation between the upper and lower worlds needs to happen. The most famous image of it is Jacob's ladder in the Bible, with the angels ascending and descending. This, in a sense, represents a kind of cosmic process. And so the idea of the Western esoteric tradition is not only to develop oneself, so that you have at least some access to these higher levels, but you're able to integrate them better with reality as we know it. There are many things, but I would say that's one of the central and maybe most important points about the Western esoteric tradition. Okay, so one of the things that you explore in your book, The Dice Game of Shiva, is the kind of the intersection a little bit of some of these Western esoteric teachings with some of the Eastern ones. And on the face of it, do you see any? Are these are they easily translatable, or do we run into any conflicts when we try to map these two onto each other? Or have you found any problems in your own work trying to map them on each other? I would say that there are general parallels. Yeah. And that the resemblances are much more striking and important than the differences. Right. But you can't just make a blanket statement saying they're all saying the same thing. Right. There are differences, and there's significant differences. So, a balanced view of that would be, there are some pretty important universal themes that you see in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, esoteric Christianity, the Kabbalah, and so on. But they're not all saying exactly the same thing. They're, in a way, their theologies may be more different than their well, I don't know, maybe their theologies are more different than practices, the Buddhists being non-theistic, and so on. With Buddhism, I mean, it's interesting that, how would I put it? In a sense, theology recapitulates psychology. Notice that the Buddhists say there is no self, no ultimate self, anatta, no self. It's the central doctrine of Buddhism, right? Well, so they don't have a personal God, right? There's a correspondence between the way we are and the way, shall we say, the absolute, the divine is. Christianity, believes that we are persons in some radical and, inalienable sense. And by George, God is person two or three of them, or, however you want to construe that. So it's interesting to see those parallels and how, we are always seeing God through our own lens. And, there is the famous quote from a philosopher, Xenophanes, who said, in the 6th century BC, who said, if horses had gods, they would make them look like horses. And now there's an interesting, to elaborate just on that for a minute, this anthropomorphization is impossible to avoid.
Yeah.
Because we're humans, we're going to see the world in an anthropocentric, human-centered way, because that's who we are. And I think we have to be faithful to that experience. On the other hand, we also have to consider the possibility that our human-centered vision is not absolute or universal. So there's, in a way, it calls for a kind of humility in recognizing both of those aspects. And I think that's true of both Eastern and Western traditions.
So what I think is really interesting about all the things that we're talking about is, there are some people that are doing, I'm kind of back to this theme of the conversation between Eastern and Western traditions. And, there's some people who are trying to do work with having cross-cultural philosophical dialogue with Eastern traditions, but then with Western philosophical tradition as it sort of stands in the academy. But it seems like there's a much more fruitful engagement to be had, on the terms of what you're doing, where we're really looking at where they were exploring the same sort of realizations. And when you were mentioning practices of this kind, the practices that would cultivate this kind of a realization, is there evidence that there were that some of those practices were meditation practices? And I'm asking that because, we often think about meditation as something that came from India and Buddhism and various Hindu traditions. But is there precedent for meditative practices within the Western esoteric tradition?
There are. One thing you have to be aware of is that meditation is ideally transmitted orally.
Right.
That's just, you can learn it from a book, but it's actually better to learn from someone who actually has done it and some experience in it.
Yeah.
Consequently, if you go back far enough, there's very little description of the practices they used because they would have been given orally. And if you go back to, say, Jewish mystical texts of the time of Christ, what they're talking about is what they've recorded in their own visions. They did not particularly say how they got there.
Right.
And so the actual practices they used, there was something called a Merkava in early Jewish mysticism, which means chariot. And it obviously was some kind of inner, shall we say, psychic vehicle by which you, could ascend to higher levels, to the Heikalot, the palaces, as they called them in those days. So those practices were there. It's just very, very hard to say exactly what they were.
Right.
I'm convinced that some of these practices did survive more or less uninterrupted. The Eastern Orthodox tradition has an enormous tradition of hesychastic spirituality, from the Greek hesychia, meaning stillness. And that seems to have been more or less continuously pursued from at least the 3rd century AD to now.
Wow. And is that like a seated meditation sort of? Is that what it looks like, or is there some kind of other?
Well, it is not a type of meditation that I've practiced myself in any consistent or regular way. So I'm going to give you the bare bones of it.
Sure.
But originally, it was the repetition of a verse. This verse in the oldest form is from the 70th Psalm. It says, "O God, make speed to save me. O Lord, make haste to help me." We say that over and over and over and over again. Later, it was changed to something similar. Now that, if you notice, is not really all that theological. There's God and you and help, right? That's pretty basic theologically. Later on, it got much more elaborate, and it became called the prayer of the heart, or the prayer of Jesus, which is, in its most common form, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Notice how much more theology is in that statement than there was in the first one, which was, "Here I am, God, just help."
Yeah.
And, this is kind of a fairly common thing, that things get elaborated.
Yeah.
Well, in this particular practice, the idea was you were to say this, and eventually it's called prayer of the heart because it would be both coordinated in the sense that your heart, which is, of course, pumps automatically rather than volitionally, we hope, will take it on, and the prayer becomes, as it were, embodied in the heartbeat.
Wow.
This is a long, detailed practice. Its center is on a peninsula called Mount Athos in Greece, which is the center of Orthodox monasticism. Women are not allowed on that whole peninsula to this day.
Oh, dear.
Even, just no women, not even female animals.
How do they keep the female animals out?
Well, female domestic animals.
I see.
I think they hunt down, like, female wolves. And I think they do a lot of female cats because you have to be pragmatic about the rodent population.
Yeah.
It's a very beautiful and profound site. SITE site. I'd like to go sometime, although I haven't.
Yeah. Now, what really stands out to me as something really beautiful about what you're describing in this practice is that it sounds like a mantra. You hear about mantras in the Eastern traditions, and then also the heartbeat. The hridayam in Shaivism, the sacred heart, and the pulsation of spanda, and then the kind of bija mantra meditation practice that's a part of that is sort of this kind of, it's a beat, it's a pulse. It's sort of, it becomes this pulsation as you practice it more and more, and it seems to be in some ways very analogous to what you're talking about. And so I wonder, do you think this is something that arises from this just primordial vibration and understanding of the pulsation of existence, or do you think there was a cross-cultural, like, historical intersection that took place that led to these practices emerging, related to one another?
Yeah, and this is, in a sense, kind of the root question at much of, religious studies. That is to say, you have all of these independent things which actually resemble each other quite a bit. Shamanism is an even more striking example because it's so universal and so unstructured, so to speak. But so was there a primordial center? And some say there was. It obviously been prehistoric times out of which all this radiated, or rather, which as a theory is called diffusionism, or what you might call the archetypal theory. That is, this grew up independently because this is, in a way, the way things are and the way we are. So people were bound to discover it independently, and people being the same, it would look the same. So those are the two poles of this discussion, and I'm not radically in favor of one or the other. I mean, they don't even need to exclude one another in that, one reason it diffused would be that this is the way things are. This, Jung's concept of the archetypes, this is the way the psyche is structured. So it's going to come up no matter where. But I think those are kind of two poles, and they're both worth being aware of. And I would, be very cautious about, trying to fit everything into one slot or the other.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about one of my favorite topics. People who listen to this podcast have heard me talk about this, a few times with different people, but I really enjoy talking about it because I think it's such an important conversation. As in referencing one of the main obstacles to our culture's ability to engage with these practices and these teachings, which is scientism or, materialism. And I know you feel strongly about this as well from what I've read in your book. So can you talk a little bit about what scientism is and what scientism is, for example, as distinguished from science as a practice, and how scientism is an obstacle to engaging with what we're talking about?
Well, probably one of the most important questions our civilization is facing right now. Mm-hmm. And it pervades a lot more political, religious discourse than we might even think.
Yeah. But
science is a method.
Yeah.
It's, by the way, a completely amoral method, because you can conduct, and it has been done, a perfectly valid, legitimate scientific experiment, even if you're committing atrocities in the process.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's been done.
Yeah.
So it's not ethical, it's not spiritual, it's a method. And it finds out certain things about the universe, certain things that it can measure.
Yeah.
Scientism, now many scientists are also adherents of scientism, teaches that, or holds or implies that what science tells us about reality is the truth, and nothing but the truth, and that there's no other truth.
Yeah.
So all evidence that contradicts this, which is extremely unscientific, but it's done, mm-hmm. Any evidence that contradicts that has to be derided or dismissed or ignored. One favorite technique is it's anecdotal. Well, that happened only once, so we can't perform it. Well, the whole history of the human race is anecdotal. You can't repeat. The World War II is not a repeatable experiment, fortunately. So if you're talking about human experience and it's all anecdotal, so that doesn't help too much. Now, my particular criticism of scientism at this point is it's in this really very funny corner, which is, according to science, and this is the hot topic now, our cognition is limited and conditioned by structures of our nervous systems, right? Bees can see colors, we can't, right? So we know that scientifically. And yet science is turning around and saying, this cognition of ours is the real thing. This is the way it really is. Mm-hmm. Now, these are two totally contradictory beliefs to hold. And there's a reason that science hasn't been held more to account for, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that is, there's this fear among the intelligentsia that if you dump scientism, everybody will have to go back to believing that the world was created in 6000 BC. So, the intellectual world feels that it's got either scientism or fundamentalism.
Right.
And that's kind of it. So anyone, fundamentalism is, shall we say, problematic for many of us. So, it feels as if scientism is the only thing we have left as a civilization. That's why people are clinging to it in a rather desperate way.
Yeah.
It's sad, and it has, as I say, far more repercussions than just intellectual ones. But I believe that's what's going on.
Thank you for that. That's really good. That's a really good, concise exploration of that issue. So, you're also, there's been a lot of talk about the reconciliation. We had Tao of Physics, which I actually read and really loved that book, but I appreciate your comment about this, that you are dubious about the reconciliation of spiritual truths with science, and I can on the base of it, or on the face of it, I can understand why, because it seems like usually when that's brought up, it's like the spiritual truths are deemed somehow more legitimate as soon as they have the scientific, foundation. So we're falling back into that scientistic, mindset, right? So, so does that get to the heart of what your dubiousness is, or is there something more to it?
Well, for one thing, go back to something I said earlier. I mean, a lot of scientific evidence is simply ignored. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of parapsychology research is as rigorously scientific, but as anything else. But what happens is, well, it doesn't prove our little worldview, so we're going to toss it out. So that's certainly a part of it. But could you refresh my memory about what the question was? You challenge the idea that we can reconcile scientific truth with spiritual truths. Yeah. Well, here's the thing: science is a method, and its findings are and must be provisional. Mm-hmm. Karl Popper, the foremost philosopher of science in the 20th century, said that a scientific theory is falsifiable. Mm-hmm. That is to say, there must be some way you can prove it wrong. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't so far, it's true, but still only provisionally true, because somebody could prove it wrong later. That is the closest you can get to absolute truth in science. Now, this is important in its effect on spirituality, because if you take spirituality and try to use science as evidence for it, what happens if the evidence changes? Like, for example, in the 19th century, there was a scientific concept called the luminiferous ether, which was kind of this unknown substance that transmitted light. Mm. It was necessary to make certain equations work out. Well, then they did some experiments and they found there was no such thing as this luminiferous ether. So all of the spiritual people say, well, our Akash is the same as the luminiferous ether. Well, now it's just been decided that doesn't exist. Yeah. So what happens when your quantum realities and your relativity theories are either proven wrong or provisionally true, or true only in a highly delineated set of circumstances? You're in trouble.
Yeah.
So that is a problem, and I think there is a point at which we simply have to say that science is a very precise, good method for dealing with certain things, and that it does not give us a whole picture either of the universe, or, even more importantly, the universe that we as human beings can experience cognitively.
Yeah.
And if you're kind of like limiting everything to just what you can measure with your little instruments, well, there's a lot, there is such a thing as human intuition. And it turns out that it's often smarter than human reason.
Yeah.
How many books about this are there out there now?
Yeah.
So, it's a very constrained view. Another problem with it is, it's very interesting to look for circularities in all these arguments.
Yes, love circularities.
Because the great thing about one of science's great axioms is that everything is quantifiable. Everything in the universe can be described by mathematical equations.
Right.
Well, that's kind of begging the question, because might it not be the case that the only reality you're seeing or dealing with is the quantifiable part?
Yeah.
And there's an enormous part of reality out there that is not quantifiable in any current sense.
Yeah.
You're kind of basically assuming there isn't. You're assuming, in a sense, kind of what you're trying to prove.
Yeah.
So, and there are a lot of funny little problems like that with scientism as a religion and, as kind of this touchstone of truth. The other thing is, of course, emotionally, it's incredibly unsatisfying. There are deep human needs for meaning.
Yeah.
And if there's a need for meaning, that points to the fact that it may exist.
Mm.
Like, would you ever feel thirsty if there were no such thing as water? I don't think so. But all of this has to be set aside, and it has to be dismissed almost a priori. And it's just depressing.
Yeah, it is.
For a lot of people, it's going to be easier just to go back and, I believe the Bible, what it says, because it at least provides some meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah, no, what you said, just to go back to what you said about the grounding spiritual truths with science, and I hadn't sort of thought about it this way, but I like what you're bringing attention to, which is that, on the one hand, science is always changing. That's the one thing that we know about science, is that science is always changing. So when you're trying to ground it in scientific truths, first of all, you're assuming that science is going to stop changing, and you're assuming that the science that has emerged is the last science, which is, doubly problematic, Yeah. So
and, the other thing about, the various, notice, if you want to talk about physics, at least as I understand it, although I'm no specialist, mm-hmm. What do you get? Well, what is matter? Well, it's a bunch of little particles moving around, okay? What are these particles made up of? Even littler particles moving around. What are they made? You get this infinite regress.
Yeah.
Or you end up with a stopping point where you have these indivisible particles, like the old indivisible atoms of Democritus. And those, of course, if they existed, would be the most mysterious things of all. Mm-hmm. So, it's starting to look a little bit like, in the early modern era, there was the Ptolemaic geocentric theory of the universe was held. Mm-hmm. And this did not explain the retrograde motions of the planets very well. They came up with this theory of epicycles, where the planet is orbiting the Earth, but in these kind of littler cycles. And that explained it actually pretty well for a long time. But then as observations got more precise, they had to make more and more epicycles and more. And, eventually it became this kind of, this contraption that obviously needed a simpler and more direct explanation. Mm. I cannot help when I hear about 10-dimensional strings and that kind of thing. See, if physics at this point is not kind of like some kind of late Ptolemaic theory where everything has gotten so complicated just to deal with its own problems that the whole thing needs to be revisioned entirely.
Wow, that's interesting.
Whether it will be or not, of course, I don't know. I'm not a scientist.
Right, yeah, me neither. Well, we might find out in our lifetimes. So now I want to talk a little bit about your latest book, God, How God Became God, because, a lot of people who are in the audience that listen to Chitheads are people who have, and I speak actually for myself as well, who initially kind of were attracted to Eastern traditions because they offered a spiritual solution that seemed somehow outside the Abrahamic notion of God and all of the baggage that is entailed with that. So I know from reading your work and understanding your work that your conception of God is quite a bit different than that more narrow, maybe we'll say culturally predominant view. Now, so let's talk a little bit about that for those that are listening to this who maybe bristle a little bit about the word God or even hearing mention of Jesus and stuff that we've been sort of bringing up in conversation. Can you open our minds a little bit on the topic of God within the way that you understand it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have two small sons, and not so long ago, one of them asked me what God is. And I said, well, God is the source of everything. God is where everything came from. That seemed to satisfy him. Mm-hmm. And I'm repeating it now because it's still the best answer I've come up with. Mm-hmm. There is this primordial source. And to go back to a question we were talking about earlier, is this source personal?
Right. Now,
the Abrahamic religions, for the most part, have always argued that it is. Oh, and it's, by the way, it's not only personal, but we're the only people it likes. Too bad for the rest of you.
Yeah.
Now, and the Eastern traditions, and this is one broad difference, tend to see this absolute in a much more personal sense, as Brahman. Buddhists might call it shunyata, this kind of primordial emptiness or openness, the Tao, that kind of thing. It's much more impersonal. Now, of course, if you actually want to think about it in fairly reasonably logical senses, it's fair to assume that the source of this universe is not personal in a way that we're persons. But that much said, because we are persons and we've been generated by this universe in some way that nobody really understands, we can relate to this absolute in a personal way. So in a sense, both the impersonal and the personal views, I'm not going to say are correct, but are fruitful.
Yeah.
And, see, religion always wants to sell its own message, right? Why? Well, if you ask a Coke distributor what soft drink you should drink Coke and only Coke. Why would they say something else? If you went to the Pepsi distributor, he would tell you the same thing about Pepsi. And so, religion has a vested interest in selling itself as the only answer. And I'm using kind of crassly commercial terms because, in a sense, it is kind of crassly commercial. Mm-hmm. Even though that may have very little to do with, the way things are. Much of the doctrines of the Christian church came centuries after the time of Christ. The early Christians did not believe, the Christians who wrote the New Testament, there were a lot of early Christians. We only know very much about the ones who wrote the New Testament. They didn't think Jesus was God, by the way. Mm-hmm. There was no doctrine of the Trinity. That was invented in the 2nd century AD at the earliest. They thought Jesus was the incarnation of an angel. This angel had many names. He was called the Archangel of many names, the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Logos, the Word. This can be found in the Jewish mystical literature, philosophical literature of the time. That great angel, whose proper name was Metatron, was very, very important in Judaism at the time. I mean, he was even called a second God, which in a rigidly monotheistic faith is striking. What did the Christians do? Well, they decided that Jesus was the incarnation of this great angel, the Son of Man. The Son, so when the priests are asking Jesus, are you really saying you're the Son of Man? Well, if Jesus is just talking about being human, they're not going to be too shocked about this. But if you understand that this is what the Son of Man meant at that time, A, it's shocking. And B, explains a great deal that is otherwise completely mysterious. Now, that was lost later for different reasons. So you always have to go back to the fact that what is taught today as Christianity and what was originally Christianity are two quite different things. You also have to go to the fact that it would seem, that Jesus emphasized different aspects of his teaching to different disciples, which, this guy thinks this way, I'm going to talk this way, this guy thinks that way, I'm going to talk that way. It's all perfectly reasonable. Yeah. Of course, later on, the guys go out and, my way is the only way. Yeah. And as G.I. Gurdjieff once said, sooner or later, it all ends in people breaking one another's heads. Yeah. Nonetheless, and there are great problems with the literal truth of the Bible. That is what my book, How God Became God, is about. It's basically, you kind of know, as an intellectual, that at least some parts of the Bible are not literally true. Yeah. So which ones are and which ones aren't? This work has been done. It's out there. It's not being hidden. But it hasn't been put in a very digestible form. And the Bible, if you want to, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, starts to become strictly historical around 850 BC. with the wicked king Ahab, better known for his wicked wife Jezebel. But they unearthed Ahab's stables. They unearthed like stelae that are contemporary referring to him. David and Solomon, who lived ostensibly 100 years before, there's no evidence outside the Bible. Almost, practically none. Solomon had this huge empire, went from Egypt to Euphrates. There's nothing.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. Not even one comb from one of his 1,000 wives. Which is starting to lead you to believe that those figures may have lived, but what the Bible is saying about them is a bit fictionalized.
Yeah.
After that, it does become historical. About a year ago, someone dug up a little seal of the Hezekiah, king of Judah, who reigned around 700 BC. Yeah, there's a seal of his. This is the part of the Bible that's historical. So, it's 700 BC. It's later than 850. So at that point, the history starts to come into focus. But before that, it's heavily, heavily, heavily legendary, including Moses and David and Solomon and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Mm-hmm. And not even going to deal with Genesis and the flood and all that sort of thing. That's a thing that an intelligent person might want to know.
Yeah.
Jesus is problematic for different reasons because the historical context is there. There was a Pontius Pilate. There was a temple. There were Pharisees and priests and whatnot. All of that makes sense. But who he was, who he thought he was, and who he said he was, is highly controversial. Did he say he was the Son of Man, or was this put in his mouth later? The answer is going to depend very, very much on which scholar you talk to. So my book is, How God Became God, is an attempt to at least spell out the differences and to say, well, that is only the literal meaning, and the literal meaning was never meant to be the total meaning.
Yeah.
In the Jewish tradition, there are 4 levels of interpretation. Ranging from the literal, the allegoric, homiletic, however it's translated. The innermost meaning, of course, is what's called sod, or the mystical. Mm. And this was always known, except not by very many people. And the priests are not too interested in this because here's like another sociological fact about religion as I see it. If a religion spreads initially because of the spiritual power that it possesses innately, and the spiritual power, obviously isn't possessed by its leaders, at least to some degree.
Yeah.
Well, the organization gets successful, and it becomes powerful. So the people who want to get into the organization and rise up are the ones who are interested in power.
Right.
May or may not have any spiritual knowledge, and spiritual knowledge is usually pretty much a disadvantage if you're kind of climbing the ladder of power.
Yes.
If only because you're not going to be really very interested in it. If you have some spiritual knowledge, you're not going to really care about that stuff.
Yeah.
So this is, and so religion ends up being bent into a, self-perpetuating institution whose interest is almost exclusively in that self-perpetuation.
Yeah, it reminds me of the William James quote that organized religion, or what is it? Organized religion destroyed the religious experience, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that I think that's very much alive as an issue, mm-hmm. because people do see angels. Mm-hmm. People have dead relatives appear to them at the foot of their bed. These people have these experiences are actually really quite common.
Yeah,
they're a lot more common than you and I think. Because people are ashamed to talk about them. There are people who will talk about them, but most people have them just shut up, mm-hmm. because everyone's just going to tell them they're crazy. You didn't really see that anyway. But if they go to a religious authority and ask for some kind of elucidation, what was this about? A clergyman is not going to be able to tell them because they didn't really study that in seminary.
Yeah.
They studied, Bultmann and Barth and all these other theologians who are at best somewhat abstract.
Yeah, yeah. So the last thing I wanted to maybe talk about before I let you go and we wrap things up is, you mentioned in the book that I thought was really interesting in the Dice Game of Shiva. You mentioned that that in the King James translation of the Bible, the kingdom of God is within you. This was the translation, which, we could find many analogous kinds of understandings within the Eastern traditions and the mystical traditions. And then, quite arbitrarily, or, for their own, based on their own agendas, in later editions, it's been translated in a much less kind of internal experience sort of way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, what is it? He basilea tu teu entos humonestum. That is the Greek.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God is within. There's the preposition there, entos rather, means within.
Yeah.
It's not one of those ones that can mean either within or among.
Yeah.
There are words that mean that in Greek. If they meant among, they would have used different prepositions. Mm-hmm. So as clearly as possible in that language, the New Testament was written in Greek, it says the kingdom of God is within you. But this is problematic because, again, if you want to really baffle, a clergyman, ask a Christian clergyman, ask what the kingdom of God is. They don't know. Well, it has to do with divine sovereignty. The kingdom of God has to do with divine sovereignty. Well, that's really helpful. They just don't know. But, I'm saying that the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, which is within you, is what the Hindu tradition would call the Atman, the self.
Yeah.
And if you understand that, then suddenly suddenly all of the stuff starts to become a lot clearer.
Yeah.
But if you can't handle that, if you don't know what to do with that, you start making these funny translations. Just as a side note, I generally tend to quote from the King James Bible in my books because, it is kind of the central monument of English prose, and it's, it is that, but it is also the most intellectually honest translation, in my view. That is to say, they didn't always know what it said,
yeah, but
they were reasonably honest into translating what they thought it said rather than what they thought it ought to say. Mm-hmm. What's an example? We just discussed one.
Yeah.
Now, a lot has been learned since. There are a lot of problems with it, but it strikingly, it is remarkably intellectually honest, and I think that's one of its overlooked strengths.
Mm. Off the top of your head, are there any other kind of notable, besides this kingdom of heaven is within you, notable differences in translation that is important for, what we're talking about in being open to the kind of more esoteric, self-realized kind of aspects of the Bible that are present there according to that reading? Well, in a way, the most important one has to do with the tripartite nature of the human being. In ancient Christianity, the human being, and this is in the New Testament, was conceived of as being a spirit, soul, and body, 3 parts. Later, this was obliterated. And again, if you go to a clergyman and ask the difference between the spirit and the soul, almost certainly you'll get an incredibly vague and embarrassed answer. But the spirit, the pneuma, in the Greek of the New Testament, was the self, this atman. Later Greek, it was called nous, or consciousness. Mm-hmm. The soul is what this spirit cognizes internal. What is the word for soul? Whenever you see the word soul in the New Testament, it is a translation of the word psyche, psyche. It's your psyche. It's all the thoughts, emotions, whatever. And then there's the body. And the body is the sum total of physical experience. That has certainly been blurred. And if you look at it, well, there's really nothing else. There's something that cognizes. There are the things that it cognizes. Some of these are private, internal,
And we call these dreams or fantasies or thoughts. And some of them are more, shall we say, collective, and we call these physical experiences. But, everything kind of pretty much falls into one of those two categories. Even, granted, they overlap. So I think that's very important. Again, by the way, the Apostle Paul did not believe that the physical body would be resurrected. He said it is sown a natural body. I can get into the Greek of that, but I won't. It is raised a spiritual body. The flesh cannot inherit eternity. So Christianity, in teaching the resurrection of the physical body, is teaching something that is explicitly denied in its own sacred scriptures.
That's a great place to leave it.
It's weird.
So, Richard, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I feel like it's a conversation that I've been wanting to have. We've been exploring a lot of traditions on this podcast, but we haven't started to talk about the intersection between the mystical traditions of the West and the East. And I think that's such an interesting and profound conversation to have. So thank you for helping me engage it. So before we close, do you have anything you want to offer? Do you have any workshops? Are you giving any talks, or anything you want to share about what you're up to for those listeners that want to maybe study more of what you're offering? Well,
I mean, there are a lot of videos out there of me.
Okay.
I would say basically go to my books, and can be found on all websites. The two we've talked about are How God Became God, which is about the Bible, and the other is The Dice Game of Shiva, or Shiva, which is about consciousness, causation. And so I guess I would say those. My website is called Inner Christianity, INNER, so people could visit that as well.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I'm going to put all of those books in the show notes so everybody that's listening or watching can check them out and purchase them on Amazon. All right, Richard.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Richard, and I'll hope to speak with you soon.
Okay,
all right,
thank you.
Bye-bye. Well, there you have it. That was our interview with Richard Smoley. If you'd like to learn more about Richard's books and his teachings, just head to richardsmoley.com. Until next time, friends, namaste.